Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. My guest today is Robert Kelchen, a professor and head of the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Robert's research interests include higher education finance and accountability practices. Robert, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, we'll focus on several issues today, including the Flutie Factor, that age-old 40-year-old term that we use as to whether it applies in today's admissions cycles, the Cinderella and Cinderella March Madness teams, and whether that effective tagline still seems to resonate today in the March Madness conversations. And then, of course, over the last 3 days, we've had things like, the impending dismantling of the Department of Education, the battle over NIH grant funding, and the financial impact on many research-focused colleges, and the Dear Colleague letter, which addresses DEI initiatives on campus that came out late last week. Shoo, where would you like to start?
It's like juggling chainsaws right now. There is so much going on, and every time you turn around, something else seems to drop in.
I know.
Let's start with some of the big federal policy questions.
Sure.
I think the first one is, will there be a Department of Education?
Yeah.
I've been saying the last several months that I think the answer is yes, or at least the functions are still going to exist. At this point, it's going to come down to legal battles. That some of the functions of the Department of Education have stayed intact to this point, such as anything involving federal financial aid. Everything else has been radically changed by just laying everyone off, trying to cut contracts, or whatever on earth Elon Musk's team decides to do next. It is just tremendous uncertainty. This is going to be one of the big cases up at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, remind our listeners, especially my students, what has been the role of the Department of Education? What has it been mostly in charge of?
On the higher education side, which has traditionally been actually the bigger part from a dollar perspective, that has been giving out financial aid to students, some support to colleges, enforcing civil rights, and the oldest function of the Department of Education is just providing useful data to policymakers and the public. That function goes back to like the 1860s, 1870s.
Okay. You mentioned useful data. I did see some news reports that came out that possibly some of that data is already being moved or gutted. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I made sure I downloaded everything I could. So far, data about colleges by and large has stayed intact. The two most popular data sources on colleges are the College Scorecard and the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System. They have stayed intact, although people involved in supporting those systems have been laid off.
Yeah, which is very concerning. And amongst researchers, this is essential data for the research. But explain too why the average college president or even dean of education might need to know this kind of data too.
This is where you get information about how you're performing relative to your peer institutions, and it is a requirement of the Higher Education Act of 1992 to provide this information. And this is really the best benchmarking data that we have. Now, on the other hand, data about students, and there have been a number of great student surveys, nationally representative, large scale, done over the years. All those contracts got canceled last week, including the ones out in the field. But the core institutional data are still there at the moment.
So, as you said, and what seems to be the case for a variety of these actions is that we're hoping the courts will uphold what we need to function, how we've come to depend on this data to be able to make good decisions about our institutions. And another whammo last week was the possibility of reduced grant funding from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. Explain to my listeners what that was about.
Yeah. First, this is the second whammo that hit the sector. The first is trying to cancel any grants related to broad terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, bias. Some terms that we use just to describe boring analytical samples like selection bias. Those ran into issues. But the one that's gotten the most attention is this concept of facilities and administrative costs. It is a wonky topic that is incredibly important for research universities. And the proposal is, or the effort they're trying to do, which is currently tied up in court, is limit these facilities and administrative costs to 15% of the direct costs. And these cover building, lights, lab space, as well as things like human subjects, just keeping everything online. But nationally, for the health focus fields, it's about a 30% actual facilities and administrative rate paid, but the listed rates are often 50% or higher. And that means that if these cuts go through, some of the big research universities, especially those with med schools, are looking at immediate hits of tens of millions of dollars. And we've started to see some institutions launch hiring freezes and budget cuts as a result.
Yeah. Obviously, at the University of Pennsylvania, we're very concerned about it. Our faculty are very concerned. We have an outstanding medical school that does a lot of cutting edge research. So it's of great concern. And while we're in this uncertain era, it's not easy for colleges to spend money right now, is it? Because they're not sure what their budgets are going to look like going forward.
Exactly. This is a great period of uncertainty. And this is also when a lot of hiring for faculty is done. That we've had people on campus, we're making offers, we're trying to get everything set up, postdocs getting positions. That's all happening now. And colleges don't want to make long-term commitments if they don't think the money is there, especially if they're trying to commit to hire people that are grant funded or primarily grant funded.
Yeah.
We've seen MIT, we've seen Boston University, we've seen North Carolina State, Northwestern, all make public proclamations of either hiring freezes or extremely close scrutiny on it.
I've heard a lot of people outside of higher education say, well, Penn shouldn't have to worry, or other schools like Penn shouldn't have to worry because they have large endowments. They should just touch those large endowments. Help our listeners understand why that's not necessarily an option.
It's at best a partial option because an endowment it's not just one giant piggy bank that you can tap into anytime. It is a series of, at large universities, thousands, if not tens of thousands of accounts that are restricted for a particular purpose. And often the purpose has nothing to do with research. It can be supporting student scholarships. It can be supporting a faculty member, say, in the English department that's not getting federally funded health research. And while you can move some money around, it's challenging to be able to move enough money around given that at most 30% of endowment funds are unrestricted. And at a place like Penn, a lot of the endowment value is also tied up in the short term in things like hedge funds where you can often get a higher return in the long run, but it's not easy to get the money out in the short term.
Interesting. One of the things also that I've seen, particularly in college athletics, is we have a lot of endowed scholarships in foundations. So endowing the head coaching position or the athletic director position or a particular position on a football team. So those things can't be automatically liquidated. Is that correct?
That is exactly true. And there are even some college marching bands that are partially endowed through scholarships.
Yeah.
And you can't take that money and directly use it to keep the lights on in a science lab.
Yeah. And I know many campuses have been planning for years to undergo building campaigns and research campaigns tied at the grants that they were expecting to get. So I would imagine that a lot of those programs are at least on pause, if possibly not even continuing. What's your take on that?
I think a lot of that is grinding to a screeching halt right now because there is so much uncertainty about what does funding look like. And federal grants pay something at least remotely close to the cost of doing research. A lot of private foundation grants do not. Their F&A indirect cost rate is often capped at 5, 10, 15, 20%. And that's where the federal government got the idea of doing it. It's easier for smaller grants in the social sciences that don't use as many resources compared to expensive grants that use lasers and lab animals and things like that I don't fully understand.
Yeah, me neither. We started off the conversation mentioning the Dear Colleague letter. So let's take a dive into that just came out over the weekend. Obviously, that's a major shift from where we've been, and I have seen emails circulating where entire lists of words that might apply in any way, shape, or form to DE and I, and even if they don't, are still being deleted from all kinds of descriptions, posters, all kinds of things that you wouldn't even imagine being done, but they're doing that. It's a real concern in when you try to create an inclusive environment on campus as to how we're going to move forward. What are your thoughts on that?
This is a very broadly written letter designed to get at basically any mentions of DEI and race throughout colleges and universities. This goes substantially beyond the recent Supreme Court decision on admissions that was authored by the current conservative majority. And it also raises questions about the ability of the executive branch to make these changes without going through Congress, given last year's Supreme Court decision that significantly limited the power of the executive agencies. So everyone, I think, is watching closely. There'll be a lot of colleges that choose to comply the best they can because they don't want to be singled out by investigations and actions from the administration. But will it all stand up legally? That really remains to be seen.
I thought a lot about this as related to college athletics over the weekend, and like it or not, college athletics represents some of the most diverse student groups on campus in most cases. And in most of the situations, these campuses are primarily white institutions where 80% or more of the students are white, and athletics becomes a way to diversify the campus. I've heard more than one president say over the years, well, if we add football or we add such and such a sport, we'll have more minorities on campus. How do you think that fits in to where this Dear Colleague letter goes?
I don't think athletics is going to be touched on this. Just athletics are, I think, viewed more favorably in this. The piece that could potentially be at risk is enforcement of Title IX, looking at the balance between men's and women's sports. But I don't think that the Dear Colleague letter will affect athletics in terms of racial composition.
Okay. Because obviously the coaches have their recruiting territories that they like to go to, high schools they're used to recruiting from, and some of those are, by definition more minoritized than others, so it might be viewed as you're favoring one kind of race versus another in your recruiting. I just didn't know if you thought we were going to go there.
I doubt we go there for athletics. For academics, it's a different story.
Okay. Okay. Talk about Title IX a little bit since you mentioned it. How do you think that is impacted by this Dear Colleague letter?
The Dear Colleague letter is mostly focused on race,
Mm-hmm.
but there have also been a number of immediate actions about clearly defining the only options for sex are man and woman, and even trying to go after a couple of state athletic associations in K 12 for potentially allowing trans athletes to participate.
Yeah, it doesn't really feel like the way we've always thought about Title IX in college athletics as even being on the radar. It seems like it's all about these, as NCAA President Charlie Baker has said, less than 10 trans athletes that participate out of 550,000 college athletes in the NCAA. It seems like taking a hammer to a very small piece of clay.
It's a lot of attention on a small number of individuals,
Yeah.
but just remembering the ad that ran over and over during football games this past fall, that Kamala's for they, them,
Yeah.
Trump is for us.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the point was driven home that that's what voters wanted. So certainly we have to respect the democracy that we live in. Any other thoughts before we jump into the traditional tropes in athletics about recruiting and retention and campus visibility?
This seems to be moving every 5 minutes. I'm teaching a higher ed finance class on Monday nights,
Oh,
and 2 of the first 3 weeks were interrupted mid class by major policy changes.
wow.
I have never been so glad that I'm teaching tonight on a Monday and it's a federal holiday. Hopefully, fewer things will happen.
I totally get it. I teach my college sports and higher education class on Thursday nights, and I'm checking literally an hour before I go into the classroom what has changed. So let's just take the broader view first, Robert. I don't know how much you follow all the changes, but obviously being at Tennessee, Knoxville, you're in a Power Four conference. Tennessee has national championship aspirations. What's your general take on where this is all going?
Just that mention of Power 4 says something because it used to be Power 5.
Yes,
It is a consolidation of athletic power, and even we say Power 4, it is rapidly becoming the Power 2. It's the Big Ten and the SEC, and then the others are lagging farther behind. And that's what led to some changes in the Atlantic Coast Conference.
right.
Florida State and Clemson desperately want out. They're stuck by media agreements, and they're trying to renegotiate to get a bigger share of the pie to keep up with the other two conferences.
Right, right. So, what does this mean for schools that aren't in Tennessee that aren't named the University of Tennessee, Knoxville? Because you've got more than a handful who aren't.
It's harder and harder to break through
Yeah,
unless you happen to get one super rich donor who wants to use NIL like crazy. There is that opportunity. And that's what Brigham Young is doing in basketball.
right.
They're going nuts on that. There's that opportunity, but otherwise, if you have a good year on the athletic fields, you're going to lose your players to other institutions.
Yes, in fact, we're hearing some discussion, mostly coming out of the University of Nebraska, that maybe we shouldn't play spring games anymore because it gives schools an opportunity to take a look at their players again. So coaches are rethinking this landscape. But 40 years ago, cannot believe it was 1984, when Doug Flutie threw that historic touchdown pass in a bowl game, which all of a sudden launched Boston College onto the map, primarily because it was on television, and their applications jumped through the roof. And for a while, their enrollment stayed high. But every year now, we hear in football, well, because so and so is in this bowl game, it's going to drive their admissions applications, it's going to drive their enrollment up. So this Flutie Factor thing will not die. What is your take on whether it's applied to today's landscape?
The first piece is being on TV. I mean, everyone's on TV now, which is making it a little bit more challenging. Also, there are fewer people watching on traditional TV. You can watch every game instead of like the three that were on TV in a given week back then. And also just the massive changes in just the strength of different programs. I mean, probably the biggest upset I could think of over the last 25 years is when Appalachian State went into the Big House and beat Michigan.
That's right.
Those are few and far between now. The record of the non-Power 4 against the Power 4 now is pretty dismal.
So is it really should the phrase be retired? Is it enough just to drive applications, or should we help people understand that while there's applications, it doesn't necessarily carry over into enrollment, it doesn't necessarily carry over to retention, and it doesn't necessarily carry over from year to year.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily carry over. The goal is that you have a couple of good years, you're able to launch yourself into a new conference, more resources, and be able to get students. And by that sense, there have been a few success stories over the last couple decades. I think TCU is certainly one
Right.
because they did it through their on-field play. Southern Methodist did it because their on-field play was good enough, and they had donors willing to basically eat, what was it, 9 years of
Yes.
ACC money?
Yes. And you look at Northern Illinois this year, they're the only team that beat Notre Dame in the regular season. And so now their football program is leaving the MAC and going to another conference because of that success. So it
Yeah,
can happen.
it can. It's much more difficult. Playing Notre Dame is a good way to do it because you know your game is going to be on network television as well.
Absolutely.
That doesn't hurt.
Absolutely.
But I think for most institutions now, the path forward is either getting some big donors to basically bankroll you into a better conference, or it's someone who's kind of been in the middle of a Power 4 conference, putting it all together, making a big run, and getting a lot of attention. So, like Indiana, for example.
Right. Yeah, they had a great year this year. They really did. But if you're already in a group of five conference, let's say that next level, or even in an FCS conference, what do you think your chances are of being successful with the Flutie Factor?
It is exceedingly difficult as a one-off. I doubt Northern Illinois sees much of a gain from beating Notre Dame that one time at this point, just because, yes, it's on network TV, but there's a lot of competition. It was early season.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people will take away from the season more Notre Dame went to the playoff than Northern Illinois won that one big game and then struggled a bit down the stretch.
Yeah, they did. They did. Well, we're about to approach March Madness, and everybody loves their brackets and trying to figure things out. Who's going to win the tournament? Who's going to go to the second round? Who should be seated where? And as soon as an underdog program from an underdog conference wins in the first round, and certainly in the second round, talk of Cinderella comes to mind. Talk a little bit about the impact with basketball, especially the time of year when applications are due and decisions are being made about the ability to drive enrollment and retention with basketball.
First of all, March Madness is not the best time for an enrollment management change because applications have been in for months for traditional students looking at a bunch of different schools. It could help on the margin if you're thinking, "Oh, I got into these three places. One looks really cool on TV." It could potentially help the next admission cycle by getting people more aware, especially within the region. But even with basketball, it's been exceedingly difficult to see that sustained success. Gonzaga is really the best example there.
Yeah, they've been a tremendously consistent program. Even St. Mary's has been a tremendously consistent program. But, I remember back in the 2010s, it was Butler. Butler was such a hot commodity, and now you don't hear as much about them anymore, or UMBC, or some of these schools that had these magic runs, but we don't know where they are today. And I guess the thing I'd like to ask you is what advice do you have for presidents at schools like those who think, okay, if we can't get it done in football, maybe we can get it done in basketball. Maybe we could raise our profile, drive new revenues, although there aren't that much in revenues in basketball. Maybe we can do this in basketball. What do you think about that?
First, it is a lot cheaper than football. It's a lot more possible than football, just because it's so much less expensive. And maybe you get that team of seniors together if you can keep them through NIL, that they can go make a deep run when Kentucky has all freshmen and they flame out in the first round. I would say for a Butler, they've had significant success. They were able to change conferences as
Yeah,
a result.
that's right.
Butler and Creighton, several others, were able to get in the Big East, which is kind of the next up power conference for basketball.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and they've had some success, and the Big East has done a very good job of really establishing themselves, I think, as one of the top two basketball conferences. Although you might argue the SEC this year is pretty good in basketball.
Yeah, I'd say even for basketball, it is SEC Big Ten.
Yeah,
And for the three sports that are driving TV eyeballs now, football, men's, and women's basketball, it is SEC and Big Ten.
yeah, exactly. So I think about all of these changes, this business of opting in or opting out of the House settlement, which my listeners can pick up other commentary about that on other podcasts. But considering where we are in this new political ecosystem that we're living in, all the uncertainty, now comes March 1st, which is the deadline for schools deciding whether they're opting in or opting out. We don't have any question that the Power Four conferences have to opt in. What advice do you have for other schools that are sitting there going, should we opt in? Or maybe we should just opt out for a year and see how things settle out.
Yeah, it's a big financial hit to opt in the short term. I don't know what the cost of not opting in is, but if you're looking at potentially up to 20% of your revenue as a share, how do you come up with that additional 5, 10, $20 million? And not every place can do what Tennessee did, is just turn around and do a 10% ticket surcharge.
Yeah.
That's rare.
Yeah, it's challenging. And I look at schools who are already, two-thirds or three-quarters of their budget already comes from institutional budgets. It doesn't come from ticket sales or donors or media revenues. And I oftentimes, when presidents ask me this, I say, well, where would you get it from? If you couldn't get it from the rest of campus, where would you get it from? And they kind of say, well, we could raise our ticket prices. And I think to myself, your most loyal fan base, which we know is aging in many of these arenas, may not have the ability to pay the new ticket prices. You may not be in a metro marketplace where you have the diversity of age groups to come in and want different experiences. So I feel like that side of the business is changing too. And in order to capitalize on some of that, you also need to invest in your facilities to be able to upgrade the grab and go experience or the scoreboards and that type of thing. So I
And
really wonder where some of these presidents are going to go right now.
and upgrading facilities is a lot harder than it was 5 years ago because just the price of the materials is up.
That's right.
And instead of borrowing at a lower interest rate, you're several percent higher now.
That's right. That's exactly right. And not to mention, getting the actual construction elements, getting the construction workers, the timing of the projects, all those things are very difficult.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as you look at the landscape, I'm not even going to ask you to predict out 5 years. I'm going to say next 1 or 2 years. What would be your best guess today, not in a month, but today in what we know?
I think it's a continued case of the rich getting richer in terms of college athletics. We're still figuring out what exactly NIL means, what will be allowable, but the Big Ten and SEC have a huge advantage that's only going to get bigger. And the only thing that changes that is if some eccentric billionaire wants to basically fund a program to the next level.
Yeah, yeah. I don't disagree. I think it's a very difficult challenge right now. The revenues are going to continue to rise with the revenue share growing each year as the media contracts go up. So it's going to be harder and harder to do this. Robert,
But will media contracts keep going up?
well,
That's the big question now.
people have said that for 20 years, but yet they continue to go up. People love to watch live sports, but only certain programs in certain markets seem to really benefit from that, like Los Angeles, like New York City, like some of the major other metroplexes in this country. It's just the small towns that don't have the same population to drive the eyeballs, if you will.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Robert, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. I know you've got a lot of insight in these areas. And while I'm not thrilled with all the changes in the Department of Education, I couldn't think of anybody better to talk to about all this.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me.